I'm Matt Wilhelmy. I'm the owner of Strategic Voyages Business Consultants. I'm also the author of Taboo Business Questions, What's Haunting Every Entrepreneur's Growth. And today I'm joined by Nicole Moss. She is general counsel for several different organizations, focusing mostly with legal services as an attorney, helping venture capital organizations, maybe thinking about mergers and acquisitions, those kind of folks. And so again, I'm just really honored to be joined by Nicole Moss this morning. Hi, Nicole. How are you?
Hey, good morning. I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well. I was really looking forward to this talk because I think a lot of times when people are talking to an attorney, sometimes they get nervous, they don't know what questions to ask, and you seem like a very approachable attorney. And so I feel like we're going to have a really great conversation. We do have a case study to get into in just a moment, but before we do that, I was wondering if maybe you could take a moment and really kind of help people understand when they should be talking to somebody like yourself, because there's a lot of different types of attorneys that do a lot of different types of things. And so if companies are interested in raising money or in getting legal protection because maybe they've already entered into something, like when is a good time to start talking to Nicole?
Sure, that's a great question, and I wish I could tell everybody this, especially out there in startup land. The best time to talk to an attorney, I think, is as early as possible. It doesn't mean you have to hire them right away, but become knowledgeable about where they fit into your strategy, into your trajectory. A lot of companies I'll join after they've already formed, and that's fine, but sometimes we have to do a little bit of remedial work in their formation documents. And a lot of times, in fact, most of the time when I join a company, it's when they are considering raising money, they're about to go to market, and they realize that this is a good time to have counsel on board. And of course, they're absolutely right. That's an area that's just fraught with issues, if you will, regulatory issues, regulatory compliance is important to investors. Investors want to see that their startup, their potential investment target is cognizant that there are laws they need to comply with and that they've done their diligence, check the boxes, and are complying with them.
Yeah, and that's what you help with, right? You help them kind of understand what those boxes are to be checked. Sometimes they might go to Google, they might have a friend that knows what they're supposed to do, and that might not always line up with the law. And so it's great to know that there's an attorney like yourself out there who really kind of specializes in these kinds of things. And so one of the comments that you made during our kind of pre-show recording or production meeting was, the difference between kind of angel investors, venture capital, private equity, all these different terms that people probably hear about when they hear about raising money. And so I'm curious, kind of when you're working with a business, how does that kind of fit together? I know you're not necessarily advising them on how to find the money, but you might be giving them advice on how to respond potentially to somebody who's interested in investing in their business. Is that kind of the scope of your legal practice?
Yeah, certainly. So you always have to consider your target market when you're thinking about your investors, who you want on your cap table, and who is going to be interested in investing in you, who's going to be receptive to the opportunity. So when you think about sources of capital, and think of it as a continuum, and it's not exact, but there's individuals who maybe fall into the bucket of angel investors. And there's angels, and then there's super angels who are closer to venture capital, and then there's venture, and then there's a wide range of venture too. There's venture who's focused on seed startups, and then ones who won't get involved until Series A or even down the line. And then PE, private equity, starts to pick it up from there. Some private equity will go early, but because they might want to be involved, but most of the times they're going to go much later stage into the corporate trajectory, the corporate life cycle. They have a lot of more money to deploy. It is not in their best interest. It's not really feasible for them to be looking at 5, 10, $20 million deals. They're much more interested in 50 is low for them. They're interested in $100 million plus and well into the billions. So probably not private equity, although I have some background of that in my history. I used to work with at a big law firm and helped private equity funds raise money and do M&A deals. Those M&A deals were all several hundred million up to several $1 billion.
Yeah, so I think it's safe to say that you've probably seen some things. You've been around this world for a while. You've been helping founders navigate some of these sometimes treacherous waters. And I would imagine that you've probably seen some deals where you're maybe even scratching your head going, why in the heck did somebody even agree to this? And so, it makes your job that much more challenging because you need to kind of protect your clients and really understand what it is they're doing. And so I'm wondering if there's any sort of like industries that maybe you resonate with more than others, or maybe that you're more familiar with, maybe not. Maybe it's just all the same across the wide, vast land of equity and fundraising. But I'm curious, are there any kind of specialties that you have in that arena?
You bring up a really great point, because startups are all companies, really. If you want to raise money, you're subject to the same rules and regulations as private equity funds. It goes from $1 to billions and billions of dollars, and the same rules apply. So in that respect, it's the same. It doesn't make a difference to me. On the other hand, how they go about it, what the corporate life cycle is, and really what the nuances are within, and regulatory, not nuances, big issues within within startups. Sure, it can be vastly different. I'm general counsel for a health tech company, and so I have to know a little bit about, well, quite a bit about HIPAA, for example, because HIPAA compliance, the Healthcare Information Portability Act, something like that, is is important to us, and we just call it HIPAA. Anyway, and so that's key. However, we didn't need FDA compliance. So if you're talking about medical device, medical technologies, drugs, pharmacies, I'm pharmcos. I'm not your lawyer, even for startup, because those are pretty specialized. I would say if it came down to one thing, technology-based companies, all of the companies that I work for are tech-based. So there's elements of intellectual property. I go higher out for the serious stuff. The trademarking, patenting is the really big issue there. And then I don't do anything that relates to, for example, tax or litigation. You really want those specialties represented. But in terms of startups, they're all facing largely the same issues, which is formation, corporate governance, securities if they need to raise money, and they pretty much all need to raise money. And then externally, in terms of contracts, forward-looking contracts with customers, backward-looking contracts with suppliers and vendors, and internal contracts with their own employees, contractors, personnel. And so those are the things that I tend to cover. Which ends up being a lot.
Yeah, but I think, when people hear the word attorney, right, that means so many different things. And so it's good to know kind of your lane and what your specialty is, so that we're able to kind of think about this case study from the right perspective. But you did mention that you had a background with a much larger firm, and I'm sure, doing a number of different mergers and acquisitions, you've seen a lot of different ways that people have tried to go about solving this fundraising problem. And so that's a really interesting transition into our case study today, which is a client of mine that wanted me to kind of help them establish some of their accounting processes and their system. And so, believe it or not, this is a company that did have some revenue, but they didn't really have an accounting software set up. Maybe you've seen that before. I see it all the time. They get kind of into it. They're just looking at their bank statements. It's really kind of their measuring stick for financial performance. It's very risky to do it that way, just because there's so many other things that you should be looking at. But long story short is, this company was a startup. They're actually in the diamond manufacturing industry, if you can believe that or not. They manufactured synthetic diamonds, and they had a machine that did this, and each machine cost about $100,000 each to make these diamonds. And so the reason I wanted to bring up this company, Nicole, is because I think that this is a company that you probably could help with. You probably have seen some of the issues that they ran into, and I'm hoping that in this first episode, we're going to uncover some of their kind of root causes, is really how I think about it. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up was, in my opinion, almost like surface issues. These are almost like when you go to the doctor and you're like, well, it hurts on my arm. Like, that's a presenting issue, right? And so one of the things that I noticed was in our very first couple of calls that the ownership team, and I'm going to use air quotes for ownership team, just because that might mean different things in different contexts, but these 6 different individuals were not agreeing on who owned what percentage of their business. Now, for other folks out there might think that that's absolutely crazy and that should never ever happen. And I would guess from your perspective and from your profession, that's happened maybe more than once or twice, right?
Without a doubt. And I have seen that it comes up more in the startup context than later on, ideally. But folks can get pretty far down the road without having figured all of these things out. And if you're figuring them out after you've made your company tangible, it's a much bigger problem than having those conversations in the theoretical before there's anything to really argue about, before there's money on the table, but before people get invested in the broader sense of the word. So yeah, I mean, I do see that a lot, and I try to encourage teams to talk about this on the early side.
Yeah, before the stakes get really high, before people invest even more money and more time into it. But what I found out from this company, Nicole, is that out of these 6 business partners, they did have a handshake agreement. There was a series of emails even that were exchanged, kind of clarifying who was supposed to own what percentage, but it wasn't totally agreed upon. And so where the rubber met the road was they had actually secured $100,000. And maybe we can clarify how that was secured, because I'm sure there's some questions you've got with that. But they secured $100,000 to buy their first prototype. And they were coming to me because an investor that they were talking to was interested in giving them a lot more money, specifically $500,000 to buy 5 more of these machines. But that investor said, hey, like, you need to have somebody that's got some sort of financial backing, that understands kind of how to set up a profit and loss statement and a balance sheet correctly, because, well, for obvious reasons. But the other issue that kind of came up was about raising more money and how they were going to go about it. But for the sake of your conversation with me and how we're going to unpack this, what questions would you have for this ownership group around maybe the 100,000 they already secured, future, securing of funds? What would those conversations look like?
Sure. Well, okay, where I'd start is, let me see what you've got in terms of the emails. Let me get what each what each co-founder thinks they should have, and even what they think the others should have. So I'd say, give me the lay of the land, and let me know so we can unpack this. As we say in law, sometimes is something is better than nothing. So some evidence is better than no evidence. And it might not hold up in court, but what is your some evidence, and how far apart are we? Where are the negotiation touch points going to be? And let's figure this out as soon as possible, because the last thing investors want to see is infighting. That is not a good company to invest in if the co-founders are having disagreements. Your money is at much more risk, much higher risk if you've done that. Then I'm interested in the 100,000. If it costs 100,000 to buy a machine, and you raise $100,000, you have a machine. You don't have salaries. You don't have overhead. Who are you? You've got to get this outside financial expert. How are you going to pay them? And where's that money coming from? So when you go to market to raise money, you have to think ahead about your runway. And again, it comes down to the investor. Investors are not going to be interested in giving you too little money if you haven't worked out what your runway looks like. So when you're going to market, you need your budget, your projected budget for at least as long as your runway is supposed to last. And what is that runway? How much you're going to raise money from me? How long is that going to last? And what are the inflection points? You're going to need more money at some point. Are you at that point bringing in revenues, or are you going to ask me for more money? And if I can't give it to you and you can't get it elsewhere, is my initial investment sunk? So I can imagine the investors have some questions, and I'm counseling startup teams to be ready to answer them.
So this business, like I mentioned, they were having a tough time kind of figuring out equity ownership. You mentioned the word runway. I'm familiar with the term, being in the financial industry, but I'm wondering if maybe you could elaborate on what that looks like or what that means to folks that maybe don't know what that means.
Yes, certainly. So you need to think about what it's going to cost to run your business over the next period of time, at which point you will either have hit revenues and you can sustain your business on revenues, or you're going to need to ask for more money. It's pretty typical to plan to ask for more money, maybe several times over. You might have a seed round where you ask for the initial amount to get to your minimum viable product that's going to get you pilot programs and a little bit of revenue in the door. But then you're going to want to scale. And maybe that's when you go back to the market, the investors, and say, I need more money in a Series A round. And then here's what I think that money is going to do for me. It's going to cover operating expenses, maybe some capital expenses over the next period of time, at which point you hit another inflection point, and maybe your revenue sustainable. So runway is looking forward at how long you think this money will last. Ideally augmented by other things like other investments, maybe some loans, and ideally revenue. Revenue is really most important.
Yeah, so this business, like I mentioned, they had raised this $100,000. I'm wondering what kinds of questions you'd want to ask to kind of clarify that, because I asked some questions, not necessarily from a legal perspective, although I was interested in the actual collateral and the agreements that were either signed or agreed upon. But I'm a little bit surprised that they were able to take 6 figures from somebody and not really fully understand how that even went on their balance sheet. So when they showed me their balance sheet, I was expecting to find $100,000 in cash as an asset, and I was expecting to find either liability, money owed to someone, or equity. And I found neither. And so that's where my questions kind of came up, like, how in the heck did you even accept this money? That's when I figured out they didn't have an accounting platform. But what questions would you want to know? Would you want to see, like, was anything signed? Was there at least an email? Like, is this person expecting to get paid back at some point? You know, how would you kind of uncover maybe how that 100,000 was originally structured?
Yes. So, and just as a quick aside here, if the SEC, if you do not have a compliant offering, a private offering, which is called an exempt offering, you had an IPO. So it's entirely possible that this company had a non-compliant IPO, which I think would surprise everybody here, because it certainly didn't intend to have that. I'd be asking them what kind of documentation they had. And going back to something I said earlier, something is better than nothing. Ideally, they had they had disclosures, which might take the form of a deck, not usually a private placement memorandum at $100,000, but that's, if you're a bigger company, that's what you put out. The disclosures have to be the same for all of the investors in your offering. You would have an offering document. Would it be a stock purchase agreement, a convertible note? There are different ways to acquire capital investment, but it is documented, and it's not usually a handshake or an email. That certainly isn't ideal in terms of compliance. So I'd be asking for documentation, and since it seems evident that there isn't actual compliant documentation, what you got? Even a conversation, I need something that evidences what was in the parties' minds, and then we can fix it. But you can't fix it until you know what you're working with. So I would ask them about that, and maybe it's emails, maybe it's conversations, maybe I need to talk to the investor and see what the investor thinks that they have. But yeah, we've got to figure it out. You're absolutely right. You need to know how much was invested. What did that buy you? Did it buy you a share of the company? Did it buy you the obligation for the company to give you the money back? If it's an obligation, it's a debt, and usually there's an expectation of interest. Otherwise, it may not be something that the law would sustain. It might turn into a gift. I don't think anybody expects that, but that might be what you're looking at. And what form would that take? When would you get paid back? Or where's your stock certificate or your cap table that evidences that this investor is actually on it? So I think we need to delve into the expectations of all of the parties, and as much documentary evidence as we can pull from kind of anywhere.
So Nicole, I wanted to summarize what you kind of said in terms of the issues that this company was facing. I'm hoping maybe you can help me out here, because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what I originally presented was kind of the surface issue, fighting about equity, right, among owners, something you've seen before, you've dealt with that. And what it sounds like we've run into now are kind of three more like surface or more root causes or root issues. The first one is that the company doesn't really have like a really clear understanding of their business model almost, maybe because they don't have a runway, right? They don't really understand why they would need one. That's a glaring issue. The second one that you kind of alluded to was that there's definitely some sort of lack of paperwork or at least compliance. And so that could be in the form of agreements. It could be in the form of, disclosures, depending on a lot of different scenarios, but overall lack of compliant paperwork. And then the third one was there's not a clear maybe understanding of what the business is going to be doing to attract future investors. And we really can't even necessarily get there until perhaps we figure out how they raised that first 100,000. So am I on the right track? Is that kind of the summary of the three issues?
Yes, that's a perfect summary. That's exactly where we find ourselves, and I think that that a lot of conversations need to take place, and it highlights, I think, the issue that I run into all the time, which is that you could be a genius when it comes to your product and envisioning something that the world needs and doesn't have, and yet that business acumen isn't necessarily ingrained in entrepreneurs and co-founders. So going out, talking to lawyers, talking to finance experts who can help you turn your idea into a business is really critical at early on in the process when you're bringing a product to market, when you're developing a company.
I wanted to kind of give our viewers a little bit of a sneak peek into our next episode, because you and I are going to be unpacking some cautionary tales. It's good to hear that this company, although they probably feel like their issues are unique, are not actually that unique in the grand scheme of other businesses that are out there and that you've helped with various legal matters. And so in our second episode, we've got some cautionary tales. And so you've got one lined up with a company who promised equity to a star new employee. I would imagine this unfortunately happens a lot. And so I'm going to be interested to hear more about that. You've got another story you're ready to tell that is about a company who raised a pre-seed on their own. They didn't have any general counsel, and then kind of got to experience what that is like and maybe got into some hot water there. One of the stories that I'm interested in sharing is about a business consultant who kind of traded advice for equity and did not go well really for either party. And so I'm interested in kind of unpacking these cautionary tales with you in our next episode, and just to kind of remind our folks who we're here with and what we're talking about. I'm here with Nicole Moss. She is a general counsel and attorney for several different organizations, really kind of focused in the venture capital, mergers and acquisitions space, working with a lot of folks in early stage startups, even folks in businesses that are looking for funding. She is the go-to legal expert. And so thank you, Nicole, for joining me in this first episode. I'm really looking forward to getting into some of these cautionary tales in our second episode.
My pleasure. Thank you. I'm excited to talk about these tales and share these with your audience.
Absolutely. Hope everybody stays tuned.